The purple dusk settled over the American West like a heavy blanket, painting the barren red earth in shades of twilight. Dust swirled in lazy spirals across the landscape, carried by winds that had traveled hundreds of miles across empty plains. In the distance, the small town of Cedar Ridge huddled beside the railroad tracks like a collection of forgotten thoughts, its weathered buildings bearing witness to countless stories of hope and heartbreak. Jake Sullivan stood at the edge of his property, watching the sun sink behind the jagged mountains. His cabin, built from rough-hewn logs and determination, leaned against a massive boulder that had probably been there since the world was young. The structure wasn't much to look at, gaps between the logs stuffed with mud and grass, a roof that leaked when the rains came hard. But it was his. Every nail, every board, every stone in the chimney bore the mark of his labor. The empty horse stall beside the cabin seemed to mock him with its silence. There had been a time when his mare, Buttercup, would greet him with soft nickering at this hour. But she'd been gone 3 months now, sold to pay for supplies that barely lasted 2 weeks. The absence of her familiar sounds made the loneliness sharper, like a blade between his ribs. Jake's weathered hands found the worn photograph in his vest pocket, the edges soft from countless handlings. His mother's face looked back at him, frozen in a moment of happiness from 20 years past. Beside her stood his father, tall and proud in his Sunday best, and his little sister Emma, her gap-toothed grin forever preserved in sepia tones. The cholera had taken them all in the span of a week, leaving him with nothing but this image and memories that grew heavier with each passing year. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of sage and distant rain. Jake tucked the photograph away and headed toward town, his boots raising small clouds of dust with each step. He needed supplies. Flour, maybe some salt pork if Murphy's store would extend his credit just once more. The weight of the single silver dollar in his pocket felt both precious and pitiful. It was all that stood between him and complete destitution. Cedar Ridge came alive in the evening hours, such as life was in a frontier town. Lanterns glowed in windows, casting yellow rectangles of light onto the dusty street. The saloon's piano tinkled out a melancholy tune, punctuated by bursts of rough laughter. Jake kept to the shadows, avoiding the temptation of whiskey and cards that would only deepen his troubles. As he approached Murphy's general store, a commotion near the water trough caught his attention. A woman in a faded blue dress stood with 2 children pressed close to her sides. Even in the dim light, Jake could see the desperation etched into her features. Her dark hair, once probably carefully pinned, now hung in loose strands around her face. The children, twins by the look of them, a boy and a girl no more than 6 years old, had the hollow-eyed look of hunger that Jake knew too well. "Please, Mr. Henderson," the woman was saying to the portly man who owned the boarding house. "Just for tonight. The children haven't eaten since yesterday. I'll find work tomorrow. I promise." Henderson spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "I told you already, Mrs. Clayton. No money, no room. This ain't a charity house. You should have thought about that before your husband went and got himself killed." The casual cruelty of the words made Jake's jaw tighten. He'd seen Henderson's type before, men who'd forgotten what it meant to struggle, who wore their small successes like armor against compassion. The woman, Mrs. Clayton, drew herself up with a dignity that poverty couldn't strip away. "My husband died defending this town from rustlers. The least I could do is mind my own business, which is what I'm doing." Henderson turned away, his expensive boots clicking on the boardwalk as he disappeared into the hotel. Jake watched as Mrs. Clayton's shoulders sagged. The little girl tugged at her mother's skirt. "Mama, I'm hungry." "I know, sweet pea, I know." Her voice cracked on the words. Something twisted in Jake's chest. He thought of his sister Emma, how she'd clung to their mother's skirts the same way during those last terrible days. His hand found the silver dollar in his pocket, his fingers tracing its edges. It was enough for a week's worth of beans and flour, maybe some coffee if he was careful. It was his hedge against starvation, His last bit of security in an uncertain world. But what was security worth when children went hungry in the shadow of plenty? Jake stepped out of the shadows, his boots announcing his approach. Mrs. Clayton looked up, fear flashing across her features before she recognized he meant no harm. "Ma'am?" Jake touched the brim of his hat. Up close, he could see she was younger than he'd first thought, maybe 25, with green eyes that held both sorrow and steel. "I couldn't help but overhear." She lifted her chin. "We don't need pity, sir." "Wasn't offering any?" Jake pulled the silver dollar from his pocket, the metal catching the light from a nearby window. "But I'd be obliged if you'd take this. For the young ones." Her eyes widened. "I couldn't. That's too much." "It's all I have," Jake said simply, pressing the coin into her palm. Her hand was cold, trembling slightly. "Take it and get through the night. That's all any of us can do." Tears gathered in her eyes, but she blinked them back. "Why would you?" Jake thought of his family, of all the kindnesses that had come too late to save them. "Because someone should have," he said quietly. "Long time ago, someone should have." The boy, who'd been silent until now, looked up at Jake with eyes too old for his years. "Are you an angel, mister?" Despite everything, Jake found himself almost smiling. "No, son, just a man who remembers what hungry feels like." "Mrs." Clayton clutched the dollar like a lifeline. "I don't even know your name." "Jake Sullivan. Got a cabin about 3 miles north, up against Wheeler's Rock." "Sarah," she said. "Sarah Clayton. These are my children, Thomas and Mary. Pleased to meet you all." Jake touched his hat again. "You'd best get some food in those young ones before Murphy closes his store." "Mr. Sullivan. Jake. I'll repay you, somehow." "I will." "No need." Jake turned to go, then paused. "Word of advice, try the widow Martinez on the south side of town. She sometimes needs help with laundry and mending. Might be she could use an extra pair of hands." He walked away before she could respond, before the gratitude in her eyes could make him regret giving away his last chance at comfort. The wind had turned cold, cutting through his thin jacket like accusation. His stomach, already hollow, seemed to fold in on itself at the thought of the empty days ahead. But as Jake made his way back to his cabin under a sky now brilliant with stars, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months, a lightness in his chest where the weight of loneliness usually sat. He'd done what was right, what his parents would have done, in a world that seemed determined to strip away every soft thing. He'd chosen kindness over survival. The cabin looked even smaller in the darkness, a humble shadow against the massive rock face. Jake gathered some scrub wood and started a small fire in the hearth, more for the company of its light than its meager warmth. He had some water, a handful of beans that might last 2 days if he was careful. It would have to be enough. As he sat on his single chair, watching the flames dance, Jake thought about the woman and her children. Sarah Clayton, a widow with twins, trying to survive in a world that had little mercy for the vulnerable. He wondered about her story, about the husband who died defending a town that now turned its back on his family. The silver dollar was gone, but somehow Jake felt richer for its absence. He'd learned long ago that the West could kill you in 1,000 ways: weather, disease, violence, or simple starvation. But perhaps the cruelest death was the slow erosion of one's humanity, the gradual hardening of the heart until nothing remained but self-interest and suspicion. Outside, a coyote howled in the distance, its cry echoing off the canyon walls. Jake banked the fire and prepared for bed, his stomach empty but his conscience clear. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own tests of survival. But tonight, somewhere in Cedar Ridge, 2 children would sleep with full bellies, and their mother would have one less burden to carry. It wasn't much in the grand scheme of things, a single silver dollar against an ocean of need. But as Jake closed his eyes, he thought perhaps that was how the world changed. One small act of grace at a time, one person choosing compassion over comfort, until the darkness gave way to dawn. The night descended upon the prairie like a living thing, bringing with it a wind that howled through the gaps in Jake's cabin walls. He fed another piece of scrub wood to the dying fire, watching the flames leap and dance against the stone hearth. The warmth barely reached beyond a few feet, leaving the corners of the room shrouded in cold shadows. Jake wrapped himself in his thin blanket and settled into the worn chair, his empty stomach a constant reminder of the choice he'd made. The beans he'd saved sat in a small jar on the shelf, maybe enough for tomorrow. Certainly not beyond that. But strangely, the physical hunger seemed less sharp than the deeper ache that had been his companion for so long. The wind outside grew fiercer, rattling the loose boards and sending dust through every crack. It was the kind of wind that drove men mad if they listened to it too long, carrying with it the voices of all who'd been lost to this unforgiving land. Jake closed his eyes and let the memories come, as they always did on nights like this. He saw himself at 17, fresh-faced and full of dreams, riding with the Patterson outfit on his first cattle drive. The vastness of the land had taken his breath away, endless grasslands stretching to horizons that seemed to recede with every mile traveled. He'd felt invincible then, part of something larger than himself, surrounded by men who'd become brothers in all but blood. There was old Pete, who'd taught him to read the weather and cloud formations and wind patterns. "Sky'll tell you everything you need to know, boy," Pete would say, squinting at the horizon. "Just got to learn its language." Pete had taken an arrow in the chest during a skirmish with Comanches near the Red River. Jake had held him as he died, trying to stop the blood with his bare hands, learning that the land took its payment in ways that left scars deeper than skin. Then came the memory of Sam Morrison, quick with a joke and quicker with a gun, who'd saved Jake's life during a stampede only to lose his own to fever 3 weeks later. They'd buried him beside a nameless creek, marked only by a pile of stones that had probably scattered by now. Jake had taken Sam's harmonica, promising to learn to play it. But the instrument sat silent in his saddlebags for years before being sold along with everything else. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney, and Jake opened his eyes. The ghosts were particularly active tonight, perhaps stirred by his encounter with the widow and her children. He thought of Marcus Freeman, the closest thing to a brother he'd ever had after losing his family. They'd partnered up after the cattle drives, trying their hand at ranching, planning a future that seemed as solid as the mountains themselves. But the winter of '76 had been brutal. The snow came early and stayed late, burying the grasslands under a white shroud that killed cattle by the hundreds. He and Marcus had fought to save what they could, but it was like trying to hold back the tide with their bare hands. When the spring finally came, they found their herd decimated, their dreams frozen as solid as the carcasses that dotted the landscape. Marcus had taken it hard, harder than Jake. The failure had eaten at him, turned him inward until he was drinking more than working, fighting shadows that only he could see. The day he'd ridden off, claiming he was heading to Denver for supplies, Jake had known he wouldn't be coming back. 6 months later, word came that Marcus had been found dead in an alley behind a saloon, another casualty of broken dreams and rot-gut whiskey. Jake stood and paced the small cabin, his footsteps echoing on the packed earth floor. 20 years in this land. And what did he have to show for it? A leaking cabin, an empty belly, and a heart full of ghosts. The photograph in his vest pocket seemed to weigh more with each passing hour, a reminder of all he'd lost before he'd even begun. He remembered the day the fever came to their homestead in Kansas. His father, strong as an oak, reduced to a shivering wreck in less than a day. His mother, trying to nurse them all while fighting her own symptoms. Little Emma, her laughter replaced by delirious crying that gradually faded to silence. Jake had been the only one to survive, though there were days he wondered if that had been a blessing or a curse. The neighbors had burned the house standard practice to prevent the spread of disease. Jake had stood watching the flames consume everything he'd known, the smoke carrying away the last physical traces of his family. All he'd saved was the photograph and his father's rifle, though the rifle had been sold years ago during another lean time. The wind picked up again, and with it came the distant howl of wolves. Jake listened to their wild chorus, understanding their hunger, their relentless drive to survive. In many ways, he'd become like them, a lone creature scratching out an existence on the margins of civilization, too stubborn to quit but too worn down to truly live. He thought about the woman, Sarah Clayton, and wondered where she and the children were tonight. Had the dollar been enough to secure them shelter? Were the little ones sleeping with full stomachs for the first time in days? The thought brought a small measure of warmth that the dying fire couldn't match. Jake had known his share of women over the years, but none had looked at him the way Sarah had in that moment, not with desire or calculation, but with a gratitude so pure it had nearly undone him. Her green eyes had held a strength that reminded him of his mother, a refusal to be broken despite all the world's efforts. The loneliness pressed in on him like a physical weight. It wasn't just the absence of people. It was the absence of purpose, of connection, of any reason to greet the dawn beyond mere habit. He'd become a ghost himself, haunting this cabin and the surrounding land, going through the motions of living without truly being alive. Outside, something crashed against the side of the cabin, probably a loose board finally giving way to the wind. Jake didn't bother to check. What was one more thing falling apart? The whole frontier was littered with the debris of broken dreams, abandoned homesteads, empty mines, ghost towns that had once buzzed with hope and ambition. He returned to his chair and pulled the blanket tighter. Sleep would be elusive tonight, as it often was when the memories came calling. Instead, he stared into the dying embers and wondered about the nature of meaning in a meaningless world. Was a life worth living if it left no mark, if it passed as insignificantly as smoke on the wind? His father had believed in purpose, in destiny. "Every man's got a part to play," he'd said once. Teaching young Jake to mend a fence might be small, might be large, but it matters all the same. But what part was Jake playing now? What grand design included a lonely man in a falling-down cabin, slowly starving in the shadow of indifferent mountains? The fire finally died to nothing but glowing coals, and the cold crept in earnest. Jake pulled his feet up under him, trying to conserve what little warmth remained. Tomorrow he'd have to venture out, maybe try to catch a rabbit or find some edible plants. The body's demands would reassert themselves, pulling him back from the edge of philosophy to the brutal simplicity of survival. But tonight, in the darkness with only the wind and ghosts for company, Jake allowed himself to feel the full weight of his isolation. 20 years of struggle, of loss, of watching the West take everything and everyone he'd cared about. And yet, despite it all, he'd given away his last dollar to a stranger. Perhaps his father had been right about purpose after all. Perhaps meaning wasn't found in grand gestures or lasting monuments, but in small acts of kindness that blazed briefly against the darkness, as the moon rose somewhere above the clouds, casting pale light through the single window. Jake Sullivan sat alone in his cabin, surrounded by memories and might-have-beens. The wind continued its mournful song, and somewhere in the distance, a lone coyote answered with its own lament. Two solitary voices in the vast emptiness of the frontier night, each calling out to a world that had no answers to give. Dawn came reluctantly to the prairie, painting the eastern sky in shades of gray and pale orange. Jake stirred from his fitful doze in the chair, his joints protesting the night's uncomfortable position. The fire had long since died, leaving only cold ashes in the hearth. His breath misted in the chill morning air as he stood and stretched, trying to work feeling back into his numb extremities. The walk to the creek was a familiar ritual, his boots finding the worn path even in the dim light. The water ran cold and clear over smooth stones, fed by mountain snowmelt. Jake knelt beside it, cupping the icy liquid in his hands and splashing it on his face. The shock of it drove away the last remnants of sleep and the haunting dreams that had plagued him through the night. As he filled his water bucket, a strange smell drifted on the morning breeze. Smoke, but not the clean smoke of wood fires. This had an acrid quality, tinged with something else he couldn't quite place. Jake straightened, scanning the horizon. To the south, where Cedar Ridge lay, a dark column rose into the brightening sky. His first thought was fire, Always a danger in these dry lands where a single spark could consume entire towns. But the smoke seemed too localized, too controlled. Jake secured the bucket and began walking toward town, an uneasy feeling settling in his stomach that had nothing to do with hunger. The 3-mile journey seemed longer than usual, perhaps because of the weakness in his legs or the growing dread that accompanied each step. As he crested the final hill before Cedar Ridge, he stopped short. The smoke was coming from the charred remains of a building on the north edge of town, Henderson's feed store. From the look of what was left standing, the town was already buzzing with activity despite the early hour. People clustered in small groups, their voices carrying on the wind. Jake caught fragments of conversation as he made his way down the dusty main street. Came through around midnight, 5 or 6 of them. Shot old Henderson when he tried to stop them. Took everything that wasn't nailed down. Jake felt the blood drain from his face. Raiders. It had been almost 2 years since the last gang had troubled Cedar Ridge, but he remembered the aftermath all too well. The violence, the fear that lingered for weeks, the way neighbors looked at each other with newfound suspicion. He spotted Sheriff Ben Morrison near the smoking ruins, his badge catching the morning light. Morrison was a good man, tough but fair, though Jake knew he was overwhelmed trying to keep order in a town that sat on the edge of lawlessness. "Ben," Jake called out, approaching the lawman. Morrison turned, his weathered face grim. "Jake, heard you were still holed up at Wheeler's Rock." He gestured to the destroyed building. "Bad business, the McKenna gang. We think they've been hitting settlements along the rail line for the past month." "Anyone hurt?" "Henderson took a bullet in the shoulder, but Doc Patterson says he'll live. Could have been worse." Morrison spat into the dust. They were after supplies, mostly. Ammunition, food, anything they could carry. Hit Murphy's store too, though he was smart enough not to resist. Jake thought of his empty cabin, his lone jar of beans. They likely to come back? Hard to say. Usually they move on quick, but with winter coming... Morrison shrugged. "I've wired for help from the territorial marshal, but you know how that goes. Might be weeks before we see any badges riding in." A commotion near the hotel drew their attention. Jake recognized Mrs. Holloway, the banker's wife, her voice shrill with indignation. "It's those strangers, that woman and her brats who came begging yesterday. How do we know she wasn't scouting for the gang?" Jake's jaw tightened. He pushed through the gathering crowd to find Sarah Clayton standing with her children, facing down the accusations with her chin raised despite the fear in her eyes. "I had nothing to do with any raiders," Sarah said firmly. "We were at Widow Martinez's house all night. She can vouch for us." "Convenient story," Holloway sneered. "A destitute widow shows up the very day before we're robbed. I say we run them out before they bring more trouble." "Now hold on." Jake stepped forward, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "This woman and her children were with me yesterday evening. She was looking for food and shelter. Nothing more." Holloway turned his piggy eyes on Jake. "And what's your word worth, Sullivan? Another drifter living on scraps? Maybe you're in on it too." Sheriff Morrison intervened before Jake could respond. "That's enough. Holloway, I'll handle the investigation. Mrs. Clayton, I'll need to speak with you, but I see no reason for these accusations." He looked around at the crowd. "The rest of you, go about your business. We've got enough real problems without inventing new ones." The crowd dispersed reluctantly, shooting suspicious glances at Sarah and her children. Jake lingered as Morrison questioned her briefly, confirming her whereabouts. When the sheriff moved on, Sarah turned to Jake. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Again." Jake noticed the children pressed closer to their mother, their eyes wide with fear. The boy, Thomas, had his small fists clenched, as if ready to defend his family against the world. "People get scared. They look for someone to blame," Jake said. "Are you folks all right? Did you find shelter?" "Yes, Widow Martinez was very kind. Your recommendation?" Sarah paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "We had a warm meal and a safe place to sleep. Thanks to you." Jake felt uncomfortable with the gratitude. He'd only done what any decent person should do. The town's going to be on edge for a while. Might be safer if you and the children stayed close to the widow's house. Mr. Sullivan. Sarah met his eyes. I meant what I said yesterday. I will repay your kindness. No need for that, ma'am. You just keep those young ones safe. As Jake turned to leave, the little girl, Mary, tugged on his coat. Mister, are the bad men coming back? Jake knelt down to her level, his heart aching at the fear in her innocent face. Sheriff Morrison's a good man. He'll keep the town safe. He glanced up at Sarah. Your mama's strong too. She'll protect you. The girl seemed to consider this, then nodded solemnly. Jake stood, touched his hat to Sarah, and headed back toward his cabin. The morning had grown warmer, but the chill of danger lingered in the air. The McKenna gang was known for their brutality, and if they were operating in the area, nowhere was truly safe. As he walked, Jake's mind turned over the problem. His cabin was isolated, defensible to a point, but he had no ammunition for defense. His old rifle had been sold months ago, and even if he'd had it, a single man against a gang was suicide. The smart thing would be to lay low, avoid attention, hope they passed by without noticing one lonely cabin against the rocks. But he thought of Sarah and her children, of all the vulnerable people in Cedar Ridge. The town had some men who could fight, but many were older, settled, soft from years of relative peace. The McKenna gang would know this, might see Cedar Ridge as easy pickings for a winter camp. Jake paused at the top of the hill, looking back at the town. Smoke still rose from the destroyed feed store, a black smudge against the clear morning sky. He'd spent years running from connections, from responsibility beyond his own survival. But something had shifted when he'd pressed that silver dollar into Sarah's hand. A door he'd thought permanently closed had cracked open, letting in a sliver of light he'd forgotten existed. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. Storm clouds gathered on the western horizon, dark and promising. Jake pulled his coat tighter and continued toward his cabin, his mind heavy with the knowledge that the fragile peace of his solitary existence had been shattered. The McKenna gang's presence changed everything. In the lawless frontier, neutrality was a luxury few could afford. As he reached his cabin, Jake noticed fresh horse tracks near the creek, heading north into the canyon country. His blood ran cold. Someone had been here while he was gone, scouting perhaps. He examined the tracks carefully. Shod horses, at least 3 of them, moving with purpose. Jake stood slowly, scanning the surrounding landscape. The rocks and scrub brush could hide a dozen men easily. His cabin, which had always felt like a refuge, suddenly seemed terribly exposed. He was a sitting target here, with no weapon, no horse, no way to run or fight. The reality of his situation settled over him like a shroud. He'd given away his last dollar, and now danger circled like wolves in the night. Yet, strangely, he felt no regret. For the first time in years, his actions had mattered to someone beyond himself. Sarah's grateful eyes, the children's relief at a warm meal. These things seemed more valuable than any silver coin. Jake entered his cabin and barred the door, knowing it would stop no one truly determined to enter. He had perhaps a day's worth of beans, water from the creek, and the growing certainty that his isolated existence was about to end, one way or another. The West had always been a land of violent change, of sudden reversals that could destroy a man or forge him anew. As storm clouds gathered overhead, Jake Sullivan sat in his humble cabin and waited, wondering if he'd finally found something worth standing for, even if it meant standing alone. The night passed slowly, with the Jake dozing fitfully in his chair, starting awake at every sound. The storm that had threatened never materialized, leaving only an oppressive stillness that seemed to press against the cabin walls. As the first pale light of dawn crept through the eastern window, Jake heard it, the unmistakable sound of approaching hoofbeats. He moved to the window, peering through a crack in the shutters. A lone rider approached from the direction of town, moving at a steady pace. Jake's hand instinctively went to where his rifle should have been. Finding only empty air, he waited, tense, As the rider drew closer, the early morning sun broke over the horizon, casting long shadows across the red earth. Its light caught the rider's hair, dark strands escaping from beneath a worn bonnet. Jake's breath caught. It was Sarah Clayton, riding an old mule that must have belonged to Widow Martinez. He unbarred the door and stepped outside, squinting against the sudden brightness. The sun painted the landscape in shades of gold and crimson, transforming the harsh terrain into something almost beautiful. Sarah dismounted awkwardly, as if unused to riding. Behind her, secured to the mule's back, were two small forms, the twins, still rubbing sleep from their eyes. "Mrs. Clayton," Jake said, unable to hide his surprise. "What brings you out here at this hour?" Sarah's green eyes met his, and he saw something there that made his heart skip unexpectedly. Determination. Yes, but something else too, a warmth that seemed to echo the rising sun. "Mr. Sullivan, Jake," she began, then seemed to gather herself. "I couldn't sleep last night. I kept thinking about what you did, about your kindness when you had so little yourself." She paused, her cheeks coloring slightly. "And I realized I couldn't let you face whatever's coming alone." The words hung in the morning air between them. Jake found himself momentarily speechless. Thomas and Mary slid down from the mule, the boy immediately taking a protective stance near his mother while the girl looked around with curious eyes. "Ma'am, I appreciate the thought, but this is no place for you and the children. If the McKenna gang is exactly why we're here." Sarah interrupted, her chin lifting in that way he was beginning to recognize. "Widow Martinez told me about this place, about how isolated you are. A man alone, with no weapon, no horse." She reached into the mule's saddlebags and withdrew a wrapped bundle. "We brought what we could." Jake watched in amazement as she unpacked the bundle. A loaf of bread, some salt pork, dried beans, and at the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, an old Colt revolver with a handful of cartridges. "Where did you get this?" he asked, hefting the weapon. It was old but well-maintained, the kind of gun that had seen service but still had life in it. "It was my husband's," Sarah said quietly. "I've been carrying it since he died, but I figure you need it more than I do right now." Jake looked from the gun to Sarah, then to the children who were watching him with solemn eyes. "I can't take this. It's all you have to protect yourselves." "You gave us your last dollar," Sarah said simply. "That dollar bought us food, shelter, and hope when we had none. This seems like a small return." The sun climbed higher, warming Jake's face. He realized he was standing closer to Sarah than propriety might dictate, close enough to see the flecks of amber in her green eyes, the way the morning light caught in her hair. Something stirred in him that he'd thought long dead, not just desire, but a deeper longing for connection, for the warmth of human companionship. "Mama, I'm hungry," Mary said, breaking the moment. Sarah flushed. "I'm sorry. We left before breakfast. I just felt I needed to come." "Well," Jake heard himself saying, "we'd best get you all inside and see about some food." He gestured to his humble cabin. "It's not much, but it's shelter." As they entered, Jake was acutely aware of how small and bare the space was. One room, a few pieces of rough furniture, the cold hearth. But Sarah made no comment, instead helping the children settle near the fireplace while Jake built up a fire. "Is this where you live all alone?" Thomas asked, his young voice carrying a mix of awe and sadness. "It is," Jake replied, striking flint to steel. "Been here about 5 years now." "Don't you get lonely?" Mary asked with the directness only children possess. Jake paused in his work, glancing at Sarah. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But the land keeps me company. The wind, the stars, the mountains." Sarah was unpacking the food she'd brought, her movements efficient despite the unfamiliar space. "Children, why don't you go outside and gather some kindling? Stay close to the cabin." After they'd gone, a different kind of silence fell between the two adults. Jake got the fire going and set water to boil, hyper-aware of Sarah's presence in his space. She stood by the small window, looking out at the vista of red rocks and endless sky. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "Harsh, but beautiful. Like most things out here." Jake replied, "The land doesn't lie to you. It shows you exactly what it is." Sarah turned to face him. "Is that why you stay? For the honesty of it?" Jake considered the question. "I used to think I stayed because I had nowhere else to go, but maybe I stayed because I was waiting." "Waiting for what?" Their eyes met across the small space, and Jake felt the words rise unbidden. "I don't know. Maybe for a reason to stop running from life." Sarah moved closer, and Jake could smell the faint scent of lavender soap, incongruous in this rough place. "My husband used to say that life has a way of finding us, even when we try to hide from it. He sounds like he was a wise man." "He was a good man," Sarah corrected gently. "Sometimes that's better than wise." She paused. "He would have liked you. I think you're the same kind of good." Jake felt heat rise in his face that had nothing to do with the fire. "Mrs. Clayton." "Sarah," she said. "Please, just Sarah." The children burst back in with arms full of sticks, breaking the charged moment. Soon the cabin was filled with the sounds of a simple breakfast being prepared, the sizzle of salt pork, the bubble of beans warming, children's chatter. It was a symphony Jake hadn't realized he'd been missing. As they ate, seated around his rough table, Jake found himself watching this unexpected family that had appeared at his door. Thomas ate with the focused intensity of a growing boy, while Mary kept up a stream of observations about everything from the taste of the beans to the way the sunlight made patterns on the wall. Sarah managed them with gentle efficiency. A touch here, a quiet word there. Lonely Cowboy gave a widow his last dollar. She returned at dawn with passion and twins. Jake thought, the words forming in his mind like a half-remembered song. The phrase seemed to capture something essential about this moment, the unexpected turns of fate that could transform a life in an instant. "What are you smiling about?" Sarah asked, catching his expression. Jake realized he was indeed smiling, probably for the first time in months. "Just thinking how strange life is. Yesterday I was certain I'd spend my remaining days alone in this cabin. Today..." "Today," she prompted. He looked at her, at the children, at the morning sun streaming through his window. "Today feels like the beginning of something I can't quite name." Thomas looked up from his plate. "Mr. Jake, are you going to protect us from the bad men?" The question sobered Jake instantly. He glanced at the Colt revolver Sarah had brought, now sitting on the shelf. 1 gun, 6 bullets, against however many desperados the McKenna gang might bring. It wasn't much. "I'll do my best, son," he said honestly. "But protecting folks is about more than guns. It's about being smart, being prepared, and being together," Mary added with the wisdom of innocence. "Mama says we're stronger together." Jake met Sarah's eyes over the children's heads. "Your mama's right about that." The sun climbed higher, flooding the cabin with light. Outside, a red-tailed hawk circled on the thermals, its cry piercing the morning air. Jake knew the danger hadn't passed. If anything, it was drawing closer. The McKenna gang was out there somewhere, and his isolated cabin might prove too tempting a target to pass by. But for now, in this moment, with the warmth of the fire and the fuller warmth of human companionship, Jake Sullivan felt something he'd thought lost forever. Hope. It was as fragile as morning frost and just as likely to vanish under the harsh sun of reality. But it was there, kindled by a widow's courage and the trust of 2 children who'd seen too much hardship for their years. The day stretched ahead, full of uncertainty and danger, but Jake was no longer facing it alone. Sarah's presence, the children's laughter, the simple miracle of shared food and conversation, these things had transformed his cold cabin into something that almost felt like home. As Sarah helped clear the simple dishes, her hand brushed his, and Jake felt the contact like a bolt of lightning. She didn't pull away, and for a moment they stood frozen, connected by that slight touch and all it might promise. "Thank you," she said softly, for not sending us away." Jake found his voice with difficulty. "Thank you for not letting me face this alone." Outside, the hawk cried again, and the wind began to pick up, carrying with it the scent of change, whatever came next. Jake knew his life would never return to the simple, lonely existence he'd known. Sarah Clayton had brought more than food and a gun to his door. She'd brought the possibility of a future worth fighting for. The morning sun had climbed high when Sarah finally began to tell her story. The children were outside, Thomas showing Mary how to skip stones in the creek under Jake's watchful eye from the doorway. Sarah sat at the rough table, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of chicory coffee, her voice steady despite the pain in her eyes. "James and I came west 3 years ago," she began. "He had dreams of starting a ranch, of building something permanent in all this wilderness. We settled near Cedar Ridge, had a small place, nothing fancy, but it was ours." She paused, her fingers tracing the rim of the cup. "The twins were 3 then, barely walking. Those first years were hard but good. We had each other." Jake leaned against the door frame, dividing his attention between her story and the children's safety. The Colt was tucked in his belt, a reassuring weight. "Then the Garrett gang came through last spring," Sarah continued, her voice dropping. "They wanted supplies, horses. James tried to reason with them, but—" She closed her eyes. "He stood between them and our home. They shot him down like he was nothing, left him bleeding in the dust while they took what they wanted." "I'm sorry," Jake said quietly, knowing how inadequate the words were. Sarah opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. "The town helped for a while, but charity runs thin when times are hard. I sold the land to pay debts, did washing and mending to get by. Then yesterday, when Henderson turned us away," she shook her head, "I was ready to give up. Your dollar, your kindness, it saved more than our bodies. Jake, it saved something in here." She placed her hand over her heart. "But last night," she continued, leaning forward, "after the children were asleep, Widow Martinez told me about the raid. She said the McKenna gang always scouts a place before they strike hard. That smoke from Henderson's store, that was just the beginning." Jake straightened. "You think they're planning something bigger?" "I know they are." Sarah's green eyes blazed with certainty, "because I recognized one of them. Bart McKenna himself was in town 2 days ago, pretending to be a drifter. He was at Murphy's store when I was begging for credit. He heard every word about who had money, who had supplies, who was vulnerable." "Did you tell Sheriff Morrison?" "I tried. But what's the word of a desperate widow against a shadow? Morrison needs proof, witnesses. By the time he gets it, the town could be ashes." Sarah stood, pacing to the window. "That's when I thought of you, a man alone, isolated, but with the high ground and rocks for cover. If I were planning to hole up before a big raid, you think they might come here?" Jake finished. "I think they might already be watching," Sarah said. "Those tracks you mentioned finding yesterday? What if they weren't random?" Jake felt a chill despite the warm morning. He moved to the window, scanning the familiar landscape with new eyes. Every shadow could hide a threat. Every rock formation could conceal watching eyes. "Why warn me?" he asked. "Why put yourself and the children in danger?" Sarah turned from the window, and the look she gave him was fierce. "Because you showed us kindness when the world showed us its back. Because running and hiding didn't save James. Because—" She paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "Because something in your eyes yesterday told me you were worth saving." Before Jake could respond, Thomas burst through the door. "Riders coming! From the North Canyon!" Jake grabbed the boy, pulling him inside. "How many? 3, maybe 4. Mary's hiding by the big rock like you showed us. Good boy." Jake checked the Colt. 6 bullets. "No more. Sarah, take Thomas and get Mary. There's a crevice in the rocks behind the cabin, barely visible. Take the children there. What about you? I'll see what they want. Could be nothing." But even as he said it, Jake knew better. Honest travelers didn't approach from the canyon. That was rough country, the kind you only used if you didn't want to be seen. Sarah gripped his arm. James, face them alone. I won't let that happen again. You have to think of the children. I am thinking of them. They need more than a mother who runs. They need to see that good people stand together. Her grip tightened. We face this together, or we all run together. Choose. Jake looked into her eyes and saw steel there, forged in loss but unbroken. Together, then. But we do this smart. They worked quickly. Sarah took the children to the hidden crevice with strict instructions to stay silent. Jake positioned himself at the cabin's front window with the Colt, while Sarah crouched by the side window with an old shotgun she'd produced from the mule's pack, rusty but functional. With 2 shells, the riders came into view slowly, cautiously. 4 men, trail-worn and hard-faced, their horses showing signs of hard riding. Jake recognized the type men who'd crossed the line so many times they'd forgotten where it was. The lead rider, a grizzled man with cold eyes, called out, "Hello, the cabin. We're looking for water and a meal. Happy to pay." Jake kept the Colt out of sight but ready. "Water's in the creek. As for food, we've got none to spare." The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Now that's not very neighborly. Boys and I have been riding hard. Surely you can spare something for fellow travelers." "Like I said, nothing to spare. Best move on." The riders exchanged glances. The second man, younger with a scar across his cheek, spoke up. "Funny thing, old-timer. We heard tell of a widow woman heading this way this morning. Pretty thing with 2 brats. You wouldn't know anything about that?" Jake's blood ran cold. They'd been watching, waiting. "No women here, just me." The leader's smile widened. "Now that's interesting, because Tom here swears he saw a mule tied up round back. You telling me you ride a mule? Cowboy?" The tension stretched taut. Jake could feel Sarah trembling beside him, not from fear, but from the effort of staying still. Through the window, he caught a glimpse of movement in the rocks. One of the riders was trying to circle around. "I'll ask you once more to move on," Jake said, letting them hear the click of the Colt's hammer. "This is private property." The leader's face hardened. "Boys, I think our friend here is being unfriendly. And you know what? I think he's lying about that widow. Bart McKenna don't like liars." So these were McKenna's scouts. Jake realized. Not the main gang, but the one sent ahead to find hiding spots and easy targets. His cabin, isolated and defendable, would make a perfect base for the gang before they hit Cedar Ridge. "Last warning," Jake said. The scarred rider went for his gun. Jake fired through the window, the shot catching the man in the shoulder and spinning him from his horse. Sarah's shotgun roared from the side window, peppering the ground near the horses and sending them dancing. The remaining riders scattered, diving for cover behind the scattered boulders. Jake counted his shots, 5 bullets left, and 3 men who knew their business. Not good odds. "You just made a big mistake, old man," the leader shouted from behind a rock. "We were gonna make this easy, but now we'll take our time with you and that widow." A shot splintered wood near Jake's head. He returned fire, driving the shooter back but using another precious bullet. 4 left. Sarah crawled over to him, staying low. "They'll try to wait us out or circle around." "I know." Jake's mind raced. The children were safe for now, but if these men got into the cabin, "Can you reload that scattergun?" "1 shell left," Sarah said. "I'm saving it." More shots rang out. The outlaws testing their defenses. Jake could see them moving between the rocks, trying to get better positions. The sun was climbing higher, and soon the heat would be oppressive. The outlaws had water from the creek and time on their side. Then Jake heard it, a sound that made his heart skip. Mary's voice, high and frightened, from the direction of the hiding spot. "Mama!" One of the outlaws had found the crevice. Sarah was on her feet instantly, maternal fury overcoming caution. Jake grabbed her. "Wait, that's what they want!" But it was too late. The leader emerged from cover, gun trained on the cabin. "Come on out, widow, unless you want us to drag those brats out by their hair." Sarah's face was white, but her voice was steady. "Let them go! Take me, but let the children go!" "Oh, we'll take you all right," the leader leered. "But those young ones might fetch a good price down Mexico way." Jake felt something cold and deadly settle in his chest. He'd seen too much death, lost too much to violence. But threatening children, that crossed a line that demanded response. "Sarah," he said quietly, "when I move, you get to those children. Don't stop. Don't look back. Jake, trust me." Jake stood up, stepping into the doorway with the Colt visible but not raised. "You want the cabin? Take it. But the woman and children walk away." The leader laughed. "You're in no position to bargain, old man." "Maybe not," Jake said. "But I've got 4 bullets left, and I'm a fair shot. I might not get all of you, but I'll get enough. Starting with you." He saw the calculation in the leader's eyes, the weighing of odds. These men were predators, used to easy prey. Armed resistance complicated things. A child's scream split the air. "Thomas, from the sound of it." Sarah made a broken sound beside Jake. "That's when they heard it. Hoofbeats, lots of them, coming fast from the direction of town. The outlaws heard it too, heads turning nervously. "Boss," the wounded man called out, fear in his voice. The leader cursed. "Mount up! Leave them!" The outlaws scrambled for their horses as a dust cloud appeared on the horizon. Jake kept his gun trained on them as they fled north into the canyon, the wounded man barely staying in his saddle. Moments later, Sheriff Morrison and a dozen armed townsmen thundered into view. Sarah was already running toward the rocks, Jake close behind. They found the children huddled in the crevice, terrified but unharmed. Sarah gathered them into her arms, tears streaming down her face. Morrison dismounted, his face grim. "Got word that some of McKenna's boys were seen heading this way. Looks like we were just in time." "How did you know?" Jake asked. Morrison grinned. "Widow Martinez. That old woman sees everything. She watched Mrs. Clayton leave this morning and figured trouble might follow. Gathered half the town to ride out here." As the posse organized to pursue the fleeing outlaws, Jake stood with Sarah and the children. The danger had passed for now, but they all knew it would return. The McKenna gang wouldn't forget this insult. Sarah looked up at him, still holding her children close. "You were ready to die for us. You were ready to die for them." Jake replied, "Seems we're both fools." She smiled through her tears. "Maybe, but living fools, thanks to Widow Martinez." Jake looked at the family before him, this unexpected gift that had arrived with the dawn, and made a decision. "You can't go back to town, not with McKenna's gang out there. Stay here. We'll ford up, make ready." "Together?" Sarah asked. Jake met her eyes, seeing in them a future he'd never dared imagine. "Together." The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Jake and Sheriff Morrison surveyed the canyon approaches to the cabin. The posse had returned empty-handed. McKenna's scouts had vanished into the maze of rocks and arroyos that made pursuit nearly impossible. "They'll be back," Morrison said, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "McKenna don't take kindly to his boys being shot at. You've got maybe a day, 2 at most." Jake nodded, his mind already working through defensive possibilities. "How many men in the full gang?" "Reports vary. 8, maybe 10. All killers." Morrison looked back at the cabin where Sarah was settling the children. "Jake, that's too many for one man to hold off." "Won't be just one man," Jake replied. "And this ground gives us advantages." Morrison studied him. That widow must be something special to make Jake Sullivan suddenly interested in living again. Jake didn't answer, but something in his expression made the sheriff nod. "I'll leave 2 men, Ted Barlow and Samuel Chen. Good shots, steady nerves, best I can spare with the town to defend." After Morrison and most of the posse departed, Jake gathered his small defensive force. Ted Barlow was a former cavalry sergeant, grizzled and competent. Samuel Chen had come west to build the railroad and stayed, proving himself handy with both hammer and rifle. With Sarah, they had 4 defenders. Not enough. but it would have to do. They spent the remaining daylight preparing. Jake showed them the natural defensive positions among the rocks, the blind spots where attackers might approach, the narrow paths that could be blocked with minimal effort. Sarah proved surprisingly knowledgeable about tactics. James was in the war, she explained when Jake expressed surprise. He taught me things, said a woman on the frontier should know how to defend herself. As darkness fell, they gathered in the cabin to plan. Jake had sketched a rough map of the area on the table using charcoal. They'll likely come at dawn, he said. That's McKenna's pattern. Hit when folks are groggy, sun in their eyes. What about the children? Sarah asked. The twins were asleep on Jake's bed, exhausted from the day's terrors. There's a deeper cave about 100 yards up the rock face, Samuel suggested. Small entrance, easy to miss. One person could hold it against an army. Jake nodded. Sarah, when the shooting starts, you take them there. No. Her voice was firm. We've had this discussion. I won't hide while others fight for my children's safety. Sarah, I can shoot. Jake, James made sure of that, and I've got more reason to fight than anyone here. Ted Barlow chuckled. Might as well give in. Sullivan, in my experience, when a woman's got that look, arguing's just wasting breath. They spent the night in shifts, watching the approaches. Jake found himself on watch with Sarah during the dead hours before dawn. They sat among the rocks, the vast canopy of stars above them, the desert silence broken only by distant coyote calls. Are you afraid? Sarah asked quietly. Terrified, Jake admitted, but not for the reasons I would have been a week ago. What's changed? Jake considered his words. A week ago, I had nothing to lose but a life I wasn't even sure I wanted. Now, he gestured toward the cabin where her children slept. Now I have reasons to survive. Sarah moved closer, her warmth a comfort against the cold night air. Jake, if something happens tomorrow, nothing's going to happen. If it does, she persisted. I want you to know something. That $1 you gave us, it wasn't just the money. It was the first kindness we'd been shown in months. You saw us as people, not burdens. That meant everything. Jake felt her hand find his in the darkness. Sarah, A sound in the darkness cut him off. They both tensed, weapons ready, but it was just Ted Barlow, arriving for his shift. Get some rest, the old soldier advised. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. Dawn came too soon, painting the eastern sky in shades of blood and gold. Jake positioned his defenders carefully, Ted in the rocks overlooking the main approach, Samuel covering the creek side, himself at the cabin with the best field of fire. Sarah, despite his continued protests, took position at the side window with her shotgun. The children were safely hidden in the cave, with strict instructions to stay silent no matter what they heard. Thomas had wanted to help fight, but Sarah's fierce embrace and whispered words had finally convinced him his job was to protect his sister. The attack came with the full sunrise, McKenna's gang approaching in a loose line, using every bit of cover. Jake counted 9 men, all armed, all moving with the easy confidence of experienced killers. Bart McKenna himself rode in the center, a big man with cruel eyes and a week's worth of beard. Sullivan, McKenna called out when they were just out of rifle range. You cost me a good man yesterday. That's a debt needs paying. Your man drew first. Jake called back. Still time for you to ride on. McKenna laughed. You know what your problem is, old man. You think this is still civilization. Out here, there's just the strong and the dead. Guess which one you're about to be? The first shots came from the flanks, testing their defenses. Jake held fire, waiting for better targets. Ted Barlow's rifle cracked from the rocks, and one of McKenna's men tumbled from his horse. The battle was joined. What followed was a nightmare of gun smoke and flying lead. The outlaws pressed hard, using superior numbers to try to flank the defenders. Jake fired carefully, making each shot count, but ammunition was limited. Sarah's shotgun boomed twice, driving back an attempt to rush the cabin's side. Samuel Chen, despite taking a bullet in the shoulder, held his position by the creek, preventing the outlaws from using the water approach. His repeating rifle was deadly at close range, and 2 more outlaws paid the price for underestimating the quiet man. But the numbers were telling. Jake was down to his last few cartridges when he saw McKenna organizing for a final rush. 6 men left, but that was more than enough to overwhelm the depleted defenders. "Jake!" Sarah called out. She'd seen it too. Her face was smudged with powder smoke, but her eyes were steady. That's when they heard it. A sound Jake had been praying for. Gunfire from the canyon behind the outlaws. McKenna's men spun in confusion as bullets struck from an unexpected direction. Through the smoke, Jake saw riders pouring from the canyon, Sheriff Morrison with a larger posse. But more than that, Widow Martinez rode with them, her ancient rifle spitting fire, and behind her came what looked like half of Cedar Ridge's population. The old woman had roused the town, shaming them into action. "You think those outlaws will stop with Sullivan's cabin?" she'd demanded. "You think your homes, your families are safe if good men die alone?" Caught between 2 forces, McKenna's gang crumbled. Some tried to flee, only to be cut down. Others threw down their weapons. McKenna himself, snarling like a trapped wolf, made a desperate charge toward the cabin, perhaps thinking to take hostages. Jake stepped out to meet him, his last bullet chambered. The 2 men faced each other in the morning light. Predator and protector, the Old West's violence given form. McKenna was faster, his gun clearing leather with practiced ease, but Jake was steadier, his shot guided by purpose rather than rage. McKenna's bullet whined past Jake's ear. Jake's found its mark. The outlaw leader crumpled, his reign of terror ending in the dust of a lonely homestead. The remaining outlaws surrendered, faced with the aroused fury of a community that had finally found its courage. As the dust settled and the wounded were tended, Jake found himself surrounded by townspeople. Men who'd avoided his eyes for months now shook his hand. Women who'd whispered about the strange hermit now praised his courage. But Jake had eyes only for Sarah, who emerged from the cabin with tears of relief streaming down her face. She flew into his arms, propriety forgotten in the aftermath of survival. "It's over," he whispered into her hair. "No," she said, pulling back to look into his eyes. "It's just beginning." Sheriff Morrison approached, a grim smile on his weathered face. "Jake, that was some fight. Town owes you a debt." "Town owes Widow Martinez," Jake corrected. "She's the one who brought help." The old woman cackled from her perch on a boulder, still cradling her ancient rifle. "Been telling these fools for years, we stand together or we fall alone. Maybe now they'll listen." As the posse secured the prisoners and tended the wounded, Jake walked with Sarah to retrieve the children. They emerged from the cave wide-eyed but unharmed, throwing themselves into their mother's arms. "Is it safe now?" Mary asked in a small voice. Jake knelt beside her. "It's safe, little one. The bad men are gone." Thomas looked at him with something approaching hero worship. "You fought them off, just like in the stories." "Not just me," Jake said, ruffling the boy's hair. "Your mama, Ted, Samuel, the whole town. That's how we win together." As they walked back to the cabin, Sarah slipped her hand into his. "What happens now?" Jake looked at the cabin, bullet-scarred but still standing, then at the woman beside him and the children clinging to her skirts. His solitary refuge had become something else. A home defended, a family protected, a future possible. "Now," he said, squeezing her hand, "we build something worth defending." The sun climbed higher, warming the red rocks and casting short shadows. The violence had passed like a desert storm, leaving changes in its wake. Jake Sullivan was no longer alone, no longer running from life. He'd found something worth fighting for, worth living for. And in the vast, unforgiving landscape of the American frontier, that was perhaps the greatest victory of all. The weeks following the shootout brought changes to Cedar Ridge that ran deeper than the bullet holes in Jake's cabin walls. Word of the stand against McKenna's gang spread along the frontier like wildfire, but with it came whispers and speculation that cast shadows over Jake's newfound happiness. Sarah and the children had moved into the cabin permanently, a practical decision given the damage to Widow Martinez's small room during the gang's initial raid on the town. But practicality was a thin veil over the truth that everyone could see. The widow Clayton and the hermit Sullivan had found something in each other that transcended mere convenience. It started with small gestures witnessed by those who came to help repair the battle damage. The way Jake's weathered face softened when Sarah entered a room. How her hand would briefly touch his shoulder as she passed. The children's laughter ringing across the previously silent homestead. These signs of domestic harmony should have brought joy to the community that had rallied to defend them. Instead, they brought judgment. Jake first noticed it at Murphy's store, where he'd gone to purchase supplies with the reward money from McKenna's capture. Conversations died when he entered. Mrs. Holloway, the banker's wife, gathered her skirts and left without acknowledging him. Even Murphy himself seemed uncomfortable, conducting their business with downcast eyes. "Something wrong, Murphy?" Jake asked, counting out payment for flour and coffee. The shopkeeper glanced around nervously. "Jake, you know I've got nothing but respect for what you did, standing up to those outlaws, protecting the town. But," Murphy sighed, "but folks are talking, you and the widow Clayton, living out there together without proper arrangements. It ain't seemly, they say." Jake felt heat rise in his face. "We're not. Sarah sleeps with the children. I bed down by the fire. Everything's proper." "I believe you," Murphy said quickly. "But you know how people are. A single man, a widow woman. Tongues will wag." Jake left the store with a heavy heart and heavier thoughts. He'd lived outside society's boundaries for so long. He'd forgotten how sharp its judgments could be. But it wasn't his reputation that concerned him. It was Sarah's, and more importantly, what it might mean for the children. When he returned to the cabin, he found Sarah dealing with her own encounter with town prejudice. She sat at the table, a letter crumpled in her hands, tears of anger rather than sorrow brightening her eyes. "What is it?" Jake asked, setting down the supplies. She handed him the letter. It was from the Ladies' Auxiliary of Cedar Ridge, informing her that her request for work taking in laundry had been declined. The language was polite, but the message was clear. Until she conducted herself in a manner befitting a Christian woman, she would find no support from proper society. "They'd rather see my children starve than accept that a widow might find happiness again," Sarah said bitterly, "as if grief is supposed to be my only companion for life." Thomas and Mary were outside, playing by the creek under the watchful eye of Samuel Chen, who'd stayed on to help while recovering from his wound. Their innocent laughter drifted through the window, a painful contrast to the adult concerns inside. "Maybe they're right," Jake said quietly. "Maybe I've brought you nothing but trouble. You could go back to town, find lodging." "Stop!" Sarah stood, facing him with the same fierce determination she'd shown against the outlaws. "Don't you dare decide what's best for me. Jake Sullivan, I've had enough of men and women telling me how to live my life." "Sarah, your reputation." "My reputation?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "My reputation died with James. I became that poor widow the moment they put him in the ground. Pitied, patronized, but never again seen as a whole person with feelings and desires of my own." She moved closer, and Jake could see the struggle in her eyes. "Do you know what they expected of me? To wear black until I died, to raise my children in poverty rather than accept help from a man who wasn't my husband, to be grateful for their scraps of charity while never forgetting my place. The children have seen more joy in these weeks than in all the months since their father died. They have food, shelter, and—" She paused, her voice softening. "They have you? You've shown Thomas what it means to be a good man. You've made Mary laugh again. That matters more than the opinion of hypocrites who clutch their pearls while offering nothing but judgment." Jake wanted to reach for her, to offer comfort, but the very impulse proved the town's whispers had some foundation. The attraction between them had grown beyond mere friendship, becoming something that hummed in the air whenever they were close. "What do we do?" he asked. Sarah's chin lifted in that familiar gesture of defiance. We live, we work, we raise the children, and we don't let small-minded people drive us apart. But it wasn't that simple. Over the following days, the social pressure intensified. The preacher, Reverend Morse, paid an unexpected visit, his thin face grave with Christian concern. "Brother Sullivan," he intoned, standing in their doorway like judgment incarnate, "I've come to discuss the irregular situation here." Jake felt Sarah tense beside him but kept his voice level. "Nothing irregular about it, Reverend. We're just folks trying to survive. A man and woman, unwed, sharing a dwelling. The Bible is clear about avoiding the appearance of evil." His eyes shifted to Sarah. "And you, Mrs. Clayton, have children to think of. What example are you setting?" "An example of strength," Sarah replied, "of people helping each other, of choosing life over mere existence." The preacher's face pinched. "The Ladies' Auxiliary is prepared to offer you position in town. Mrs. Clayton, cleaning work, respectable lodging. You need not continue in this arrangement." "How generous," Sarah said, her voice dripping sarcasm. "The same ladies who turned me away when I was desperate now offer charity, if I'll abandon the man who saved us." "Sarah," Jake warned quietly, seeing the preacher's face redden. But she was past caution. "Where was the church's help when my children were hungry? Where was Christian charity when we had nowhere to sleep? Jake Sullivan gave us his last dollar while your congregation gave us nothing but cold shoulders." Reverend Morse drew himself up. "I'll pray for your soul, Mrs. Clayton, and yours, Mr. Sullivan. But until you rectify this sinful situation, you'll find no welcome in God's house." After he left, Jake and Sarah stood in silence, the weight of social censure pressed down like the desert heat. Jake could see the toll it was taking on Sarah, the tightness around her eyes, the way she held herself as if preparing for another blow. That evening, as they shared a simple supper, even the children seemed to sense the change. Thomas pushed his beans around his plate, finally asking, "Why don't the town folks like us anymore?" Sarah started to answer, but Jake spoke first. "Sometimes people get scared when they see others being happy in ways they don't understand. It's not about us. Son, it's about them." Mary, with a child's direct wisdom, asked, "Are you and Mama going to get married?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Jake and Sarah looked at each other across the table, a whole conversation in that glance. The attraction was there, had been since that first dawn when she'd returned. But marriage born from social pressure rather than free choice seemed wrong. "That's grown-up business, sweet pea," Sarah said gently. "Right now, we're just grateful to be together and safe." But safety was relative. The next day brought a new threat. 3 men from town, led by Holloway himself, arriving with what they called a proposition. "Sullivan, we respect what you did against McKenna," Holloway began, mopping his florid face. "But this situation with Mrs. Clayton, it's causing unrest, bad for the town's reputation." "Since when is the town's reputation my concern?" Jake asked. "Since we're prepared to make it worth your while." Holloway produced a leather pouch, heavy with coin. $500, enough to set Mrs. Clayton up proper in town, maybe send the children to school back east. All we ask is that you distance yourself. Go back to being the hermit on the hill." Jake felt rage build in his chest, cold and deadly as a winter storm. "You're trying to buy me off? We're offering a solution that benefits everyone," Holloway insisted. "The widow gets respectability, the children get education, you get peace. Everyone wins. Everyone except the people who actually matter," Sarah said from the doorway. None of them had heard her approach. She walked forward, her dignity intact despite her patched dress and work-worn hands. "Mr. Holloway, I wouldn't take your money if my children were starving, which, I might remind you, they nearly were while you and yours looked the other way. Now see here." "No, you see," Sarah's voice could have cut glass. "Jake Sullivan is twice the man of anyone in your respectable society. He's shown my children more kindness and guidance than their own blood relatives. And if that threatens you, perhaps you should examine why. Holloway's face purpled. You're making a mistake, woman. This offer won't stand forever? Good, Jake said, stepping protectively closer to Sarah. Because neither will your presence on my land. Get out. As the delegation retreated, Jake could see the lines being drawn. It was no longer just about propriety. It was about power, about the town's established order feeling threatened by those who refused to conform. That night, as they sat by the fire after the children were asleep, the weight of their situation pressed down. Jake stared into the flames. Remembering his years of solitude, it had been simpler then. Lonelier, but simpler. I won't be driven away, Sarah said quietly, reading his thoughts. Not by outlaws, not by poverty, and not by the spite of small people. They could make things difficult, Jake warned. Cut us off from supplies, work, everything. Sarah moved from her chair to sit beside him on the floor, her head finding his shoulder as naturally as water finds its level. Then we'll make our own way. Grow our own food. Raise cattle. Build something they can't touch. Jake allowed his arm to encircle her, drawing her close. It was the first time they'd permitted themselves such intimacy, and it felt like coming home. Is that what you want? To build something here, together? She turned to look up at him, firelight dancing in her green eyes. What I want is to stop pretending that what's growing between us doesn't exist. I've lost too much to fear happiness when it's offered. Jake cupped her face gently, seeing in her eyes a future that terrified and thrilled him in equal measure. Sarah, She silenced him with a kiss, soft and sure, tasting of coffee and courage. When they parted, both were breathless. The town will talk, he said. Let them, she replied. We've faced down outlaws and survived poverty. Gossip seems a small dragon to slay. The autumn sunset painted the sky in brilliant shades of crimson and gold, transforming the harsh landscape into something almost magical. 6 months had passed since the showdown with McKenna's gang, and the small homestead by Wheeler's Rock had been transformed in ways both visible and profound. Where once a lonely cabin had stood against the elements, now a proper ranch was taking shape. New fencing stretched across the property, marking boundaries not just of land but of dreams made manifest. A barn, still smelling of fresh-cut pine, sheltered 3 cows and a handful of chickens, the beginning of a real working farm. The cabin itself had been expanded, with a proper room for the children and a kitchen that Sarah had made warm and welcoming. Jake stood by the new corral, watching Thomas work with a young colt they'd acquired from a traveling trader. The boy had grown inches in the past months, his movements confident as he spoke softly to the nervous animal. It was a sight that still caught Jake off guard, this sense of continuity, of passing knowledge to the next generation. He's got your patience, Sarah said, joining him at the fence. She carried Mary on her hip, the little girl's hair ribboned for Sunday despite it being only Thursday. Every day was special now, Sarah said, when you had reason to celebrate life. And his father's courage, Jake replied, slipping an arm around Sarah's waist. The gold band on his finger still felt new, though they'd been married for 3 months now. The wedding had been a small affair, held right here on their land with only a handful of true friends attending. Sheriff Morrison had stood as Jake's witness, while Widow Martinez, tears streaming down her weathered face, had stood with Sarah. Samuel Chen had played his fiddle, and Ted Barlow had supplied his special recipe punch that had everyone dancing despite the sparse attendance. The town's respectable folk had stayed away, of course, but their absence had been more than made up for by the presence of those who truly mattered, the Mexican families from the South Side who understood struggle, the Chinese railroad workers who knew about building new lives far from home, the other outcasts and misfits who recognized genuine love when they saw it. Mama, look! Mary pointed to where a red-tailed hawk circled overhead. Is it the same one? Could be. Sweet pea, Sarah said, though in truth, one hawk looked much like another. But they'd taken to watching for the bird that had circled during their first morning together, treating it as a good luck omen. The sound of approaching horses drew their attention. 2 riders were coming up the trail, and Jake's hand instinctively moved toward where his gun would have been. Old habits died hard, even in peaceful times. But as the riders drew closer, Jake relaxed. It was Ben Morrison and, surprisingly, Reverend Morse. The preacher looked uncomfortable, his thin face pinched as if he'd swallowed something sour. "Afternoon, Jake, Sarah," Morrison called out, dismounting with the ease of a man who'd spent his life in the saddle. "Sorry to come unannounced." "You're always welcome." "Ben," Jake said, though his eyes were on the Reverend. "Reverend Morse." The preacher climbed down from his horse more carefully, his black coat dusty from the ride. "Mr. Sullivan, Mrs. Sullivan." The name seemed to stick in his throat, but at least he used it. Progress of a sort. "What brings you out here?" Sarah asked, shifting Mary to her other hip. Morrison glanced at the Reverend, who seemed to be gathering his courage. Finally, the thin man spoke. "I've come to, that is, the church board has decided, well, there's been some discussion." "What he's trying to say," Morrison interjected with barely concealed amusement, "is that half his congregation is threatening to start their own church if he doesn't make peace with you folks. Seems Widow Martinez has been giving quite the sermons about Christian charity and judgment." The Reverend's face flushed. "The spiritual health of the community is my concern, and it seems, that is, perhaps I was hasty in my previous assessment." Jake felt Sarah tense beside him. He knew she had little forgiveness for those who'd shown their true colors in their time of need, but he also knew the value of peace in a small community. "We appreciate you coming out, Reverend," Jake said carefully. "Though we've found our own way to worship, the sky makes a fine cathedral, and the wind carries prayers as well as any choir." "Be that as it may," the Reverend pressed on, "your children should have proper religious education. The church school, our children are learning just fine." Sarah interrupted. "Thomas can read better than most adults, and Mary knows her numbers. They're learning the Bible too, along with respect for all people, not just the ones who dress fine on Sundays." The Reverend's face tightened, but Morrison laughed outright. "Give it up, Morse. You came to make peace, not convert them. Take the olive branch and go." After a few more strained pleasantries, the visitors departed. Jake and Sarah watched them go, then looked at each other and burst out laughing. "Did you see his face when you mentioned respect for all people?" Jake gasped. "I thought he might swallow his tongue." Sarah giggled, sounding younger than her years. Their laughter drew Thomas from the corral. "What's funny?" "Just grown-up foolishness," Jake said, ruffling the boy's hair. "How's the colt coming along?" "He's smart," Thomas said proudly. "Learned to come when I whistle already." "Can I name him?" "Of course," Sarah said. "What are you thinking?" "Hope," Thomas said without hesitation. "Because that's what he is, right? Hope for our ranch." Jake felt his throat tighten. From the mouths of children came the deepest truths. Hope's a fine name. Sun. As the sun sank lower, painting their small domain in warm light, Jake reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From that desperate night when he'd given away his last dollar to this moment of simple domestic peace, it seemed like a lifetime, and yet no time at all. The ranch was thriving, small as it was. They'd sold their first calf last month, and Sarah's garden had produced enough vegetables to sell at the Mexican market on the south side of town. The respectable folks might shun them, but there were plenty of others happy to buy from the couple who'd stood up to both outlaws and social propriety. "Jake," Sarah said softly, "there's something I need to tell you." Something in her tone made him look at her closely. There was a glow about her, a secret smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "What is it?" She took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "By spring, Thomas and Mary won't be the only children calling you Papa." Jake stood frozen, the implications washing over him like a flash flood. A baby. Their baby. New life growing in this place that had seemed so barren just a year ago. "Is it?" "Sure as sunrise," Sarah laughed at his stammering. "Widow Martinez confirmed it yesterday. She says it'll be a boy, but she's been wrong before." Jake pulled her close, burying his face in her hair to hide the tears that threatened. A family. A real family. Built not from loss and desperation, but from choice and love. It was more than he'd ever dared dream in those long, lonely years. "Hey, mister! Jake!" Thomas called. "Come see. Hope's following me without the rope." They walked together to the corral, Mary chattering about the baby, wanting to know if it would be a sister or a brother. Thomas demonstrated his success with the colt, beaming with pride when the animal came at his whistle. As they stood there, the four of them, soon to be 5. Jake thought about that night when he'd given away his last dollar. He'd thought he was choosing between survival and conscience. He hadn't realized he was choosing life itself. The hawk circled one more time overhead, its cry piercing the evening air before it disappeared over the rocks. Sarah leaned into him. The children laughed, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack. The sounds of the frontier, harsh and beautiful, dangerous and free. "No regrets?" Sarah asked quietly, reading his contemplative mood. Jake looked at his wife, at the children who'd become his own, at the land they were taming together. He thought of the lonely man he'd been, slowly dying in his isolation, convinced that survival meant solitude. How wrong he'd been. "Not a one," he said, meaning it with every fiber of his being. "That dollar was the best investment I ever made." Sarah laughed, the sound bright as water over stones. "Remind me to teach you about interest rates. I think we still owe you considerable returns." As darkness gathered, they headed inside, Thomas and Mary racing ahead while Jake and Sarah followed more slowly. At the door, Jake paused, looking back at the vast expanse of prairie and mountain, at the stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. Somewhere out there, other lonely souls were facing their own dark nights, their own moments of decision between safety and compassion. Jake offered a silent prayer that they would choose as he had, to risk comfort for connection, to gamble security for the chance at something greater. "Coming," Sarah called from inside, where lamplight now glowed warm against the evening's chill. "Coming," Jake answered, stepping through the door into the light, into the laughter, into the life he'd never known he was seeking until it found him. The door closed on the night, but not on the story. For in the American West, every ending was just another beginning, every sunset a promise of tomorrow's dawn. And at the small ranch by Wheeler's Rock, where a lonely cowboy had given a widow his last dollar, the future stretched ahead as vast and full of promise as the frontier itself. In that cabin, with its walls strong against the wind and its hearth warm against the cold, a family gathered around the table. They spoke of the day past and the day to come, of colts and gardens and babies yet to be born. Simple talk, but weighted with the gold of belonging. And if, in the corner where shadow met light, the ghost of the man Jake had been watched this scene with wonder, it did so with joy rather than regret. For some transformations are so complete that the person we were can only marvel at who we've become. The coyotes sang their ancient songs to the stars. The wind whispered its secrets through the sage, and life, stubborn, hopeful, irrepressible life, continued its eternal dance on the edge of civilization, where love proved stronger than law and kindness more valuable than gold. Thank you for listening to this Wild West love story. Where are you listening from? Drop a comment below and let's connect. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts on Jake and Sarah's journey. Your support helps us bring more of these heartfelt frontier tales to life.